It appears you can make a pretty good living by complaining about the world falling apart. But that doesn't help fix the problems that you're profiting from. It appears that you can make a pretty good living by complaining about the world falling apart so long as you don't include any form of solution to the source of the collapse. If we just take a look at two categories of books, dystopian novels and some found in nonfiction, we might come across 1984 by Orwell, or by the same author, Animal Farm. And then there's Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, The Giver by Lois Lowry, The Hunger Games by Collins, The Handmaid's Tale by Atwood, The Road by Cormac McCarthy, The Trial by Franz Kafka, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, and Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. And then we have nonfiction, The Fourth Turning by William Strauss and Neil Howe, How You Can Find Happiness During the Collapse of Western Civilization by Robert Ringer, The End of the World is Just the Beginning by Peter Zayan, Why Men Hate Going to Church by David Murrow, References in Anti-Fragile by Nicholas Nassim Taleb, Our Point Man by Farrar, Becoming a Barbarian by Jack Donovan, The Coddling of the American Mind by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt, and that is just a list to begin. And then we can dig into both digital and radio media. While just preparing this episode, I ran into Is This the Most Absurd Time in Human History? An interview by William Christensen of Rudyard Lynch. Or Theater Kids Took Over the Government by John Doyle. How America Was Brainwashed, 4 Steps Explained by John Lovell. Armed illegal immigrant gang takes over an apartment by Tim Pool. You can zoom out a little bit further from some of the immediacy of the moment. Where we're at, it's a political year, it's an election year. Rhetoric is at an all-time high. Accusations of stolen valor and flagrant lying in the political sphere seem to be so consistent that it drives urgency up with the individual. You have to get out. You have to do something. Trump has to save America. Kamala will save our democracy. The threats to our daily lives are so extreme that they are finally coming to a head. Maybe not yet, but soon. Be ready. Or you have the conspiracy theories of how some small cabal runs the entire world, or how some obscure concept like white supremacy is the source of all evil, or how capitalism, blah, 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 blah. It goes on and on and on. You have modern religions like climate change, or movements that we'll get into in the later parts of this episode. And finally, if you've been around since the 90s, you might be familiar with the old God's judgment is here upon our country, or we will face God's judgment if we don't correct our path. Now, all of this material, well, most of this material, with the exception of religious texts, have come out after the 1900s, and at the same time, we're finding new words enter into our language again. We have anemoia, which is a feeling of nostalgia for a time or an experience that somebody never had. You might have a sense of nostalgia for growing up with the Lord of the Rings and having that sort of beautiful narrative story of good versus evil be the motivating force for your childhood to aspire to greatness. Or you grew up with books or movies like Harry Potter, which still pit good versus evil, or even there is this sort of nostalgia for the golden years of man, when man loved his neighbor and worked a job that was reasonable, and he could afford his family's home off of a single income, whatever that is. Most of the people who yearn for some form of stability that is being depicted in historical times never really experienced it. They don't have the first-hand experience to even qualify that it existed. They have an anemoia for the golden years of America or the golden years of man. But the sign of the collapse seems to be all around us. Just look outside your window. If you live in a city, are there more homeless people around than there were 1, 2, 3 years ago? While the news may tell you that crime is down, unless you're in one of those areas privileged enough to avoid it, is crime really down in your neighborhood? Do you frequently make trips into the city, or do you try to avoid it at all costs now? Is it really worth it to get some small piece of consumerism at the risk of having your car stolen or have to observe the depression that is the city? Or if you live in the country, can you really afford to live like the way your parents lived? Are your neighbors really your neighbors anymore, or have you lost that sense of community? If you live in the countryside, do you feel more or less connected with your community, or can you afford the same things? Now, I'm very excited to announce the first official sponsor of the Redacted Culture Cast. Obsidian Arms is one of those companies that reflects the many facets of gun culture. Not only are their firearms frequently found on competition fields like USPSA and 3Gun, but they are a Minnesota-based, US-sourced original equipment manufacturer. Obsidian Arms makes their own punch and tool kits for the amateur and professional gunsmith out of Little Canada, Minnesota, that come with a lifetime warranty. Whether it is fine parts that require a Swiss machine, or you're in the design phase and are looking for an American machine shop that is in tune with the needs of gun culture, go check out Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. Thank you, and now back to the show. Chapter 1, A Brief History of One Subsection of Philosophy. Now, eras in history are most often descriptive. It's very rare, or it would be hard to find some sort of intentional prescriptive element that drove a culture from one moment to the next. And typically when we're talking about a subject this large, we're talking about something that is greater than maybe the will of any individual. At best, it can be a culture or a community. But what we're looking at here when we're talking about the pre-modern, modern, and postmodern eras is the mechanism of belief and how it changed. The mechanism of belief could or might be something like, what is the axiom of belief for the individual, or what does it mean for someone to believe something? And so when we talk about the pre-modern era, we might say that, when we talk about the pre-modern era, the mechanism of belief, the axiom of belief would have been something like revelation, whereas the modern era was rationalism, and then the era following era, the postmodern era, would be authenticity. Now, this can be explained a little bit further in some of the writings of Thomas Kuhn, particularly on the structure of scientific revolution. This is where we get the idea of a paradigm and a paradigm shift, but let me condense it quickly. A paradigm is by Thomas Kuhn, or Thomas Kuhn's use of the word paradigm refers to a universally recognized scientific achievement that, for a time, provides model problems and solutions for a body of researchers. So a paradigm is sort of a foundational achievement or a foundational belief system that serves for a while. Think of it like a platter or a tray. It is the foundation that all of the other, as we might call, science is done upon it. These oftentimes come in the names of the Newtonian revolution or Newtonian physics and Einsteinian physics or something of that sort. Now, a paradigm, again, think of it like a platter that serves as a foundation for a period of time. But over time, anomalies build up on the edges of that platform. Small problems that cannot necessarily be answered by the paradigm or directly challenge its legitimacy kind of start to pile up over time. What is thought of as sort of the status quo in a belief system continues to build, or what is thought of as the status quo continues to gain anomalies and contradictions or challenges to its legitimacy until eventually that plate topples over. Now replace a scientific paradigm with a government. Over time, a government collects debts or detractors or challengers. By such thing as might, fortune, or providence, it might be able to power through or survive such things. But what happens when those detractors pile up high enough is that maybe a combination of things, a plague, economic, and military losses, can cause that paradigm or that government to tip over. This is primarily what we see as the work of insurgencies, at least in our contemporary era. Now, sometimes that paradigm might shift within a government in a smaller way, We might see changes in policy or a change in the way that elections go. We also might see a change in the mechanism of leadership, absolute monarch to constitutional monarch. So let's take that idea again, this idea of the paradigm shift within a scientific revolution, which we might see in one line of history, and then compare it to a political paradigm shift, a revolution, in another sense, and now take that same concept and apply it to the mechanism of belief. Just like Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions, what these eras that we're referring to as the modern, pre-modern, modern, and postmodern belief represent are eras where the paradigm of belief existed for some time until it shifted. Some of that shift could very well have been deliberate, but it isn't entirely the case. Eventually, a paradigm of belief might collect enough debt and enough problems that it can't hold itself up. Now, the paradigm shift that took place between what history books call the medieval period and the Enlightenment was a shift in the paradigm of belief, on what foundation it meant to believe a thing. Mary Shelley's book Frankenstein illustrates this shift from a pre-modern to a modern, or from a medieval to a Enlightenment era thinking, by creating a fictional version of the tabula rasa, of a man who is born fully functional as far as physicality and mental faculty, but doesn't have society's training with him. This is Frankenstein's monster. You also see this represented in various forms of literature. Sometimes you might refer to someone like Descartes, which is where we get the phrase, "I think, therefore I am," in his Meditations on First Philosophy. Now, you can oftentimes look at the medieval era and identify something like revelation as the axiom of belief, that all belief was centered around the idea of revelation. And an oversimplified term might look at revelation as something like God wills it, but if you dig in a little bit more thoroughly, you'll find that what it meant to believe something is that it was revealed to you, and in order for it to be revealed, it must exist in the first place. And so revelation isn't so much God told me, but it's much more like a series of dependencies, such as in order to experience something, it must have existed. In order for it to have existed and me to have experienced it, it had to have been revealed to me. And so there is an element of experience, but experience might be considered an act or a participation in the act of revelation. It's not quite simply like hearing a voice from the sky, but something much more thorough. In the medieval era, to believe something depended on it being revealed to somebody, and in order for it to be revealed, or in order for something to be experienced, it had to be first revealed. It had to be made or created, and so forth. But near the end of what we call the medieval period, or the pre-modern era, there was this rise in something we would call humanism. In our day and age, we might, in 2024, we might oftentimes hear of the phrase secular humanism, which is quite distinctly different than this form of humanism. The form of humanism that we see today, this secular humanism, sort of places man at the top of even the ontological pyramid, that mankind is the biggest thing in the hierarchy. Or it might look something kind of like Neil deGrasse Tyson or this new atheism. But the version of humanism that we saw at this time, that was present during the shift from the medieval period to the Enlightenment, oftentimes referred to as the Renaissance, the form of humanism is best depicted in someone like Da Vinci. And there was a hope and a belief and an understanding that mankind actually could know things about the world by simply observing it and using their mental faculty. Now, somebody overzealous on seeing on this idea might think that people before that time didn't use their mind at all. They just simply followed the rules, and people after that time were enlightened to use their mind to observe the world around them. But that would be, again, a gross oversimplification. Instead, what we saw this gradual hope and expanse in mankind's not ability, but trust in their own faculty expand and expand, shifting a paradigm from revelation, which revelation tipped over and said, well, how can all these things be true and all be equally revealed if we're seeing so many contradictions in them? Applying the criticism of mankind's fallibility to the divine. Over time, the paradigm shifted from revelation, the world as revealed to us, to the rational, the world as we are able to observe and manipulate. So the Enlightenment was born. Rationalism became the new paradigm. The new paradigm of rationalism expanded in an era that is oftentimes presented as a period of great innovations, both physical and otherwise, from the steam engine to the Magna Carta to the American Constitution, but it had its dark days as well. You can look at some of the writing on rote or pure utilitarianism, which argued that if we could kill 10 people to save 1,000, it would be justified regardless of the innocence of those people. Again, this is a simplification of it, but it also led to some problems. For example, the French Revolution is seen as the beginning of the end of the rational period. But that led on through additional religious wars, and then we saw things like the machine gun, and there were problems, challenges brought to the legitimacy of rationalism, ultimately in what took place in World War I. So just as the pre-modern era might have had the Crusades that gave way to the Renaissance into the Enlightenment, which became the modern era had its own great wars. And those wars were the French Revolution through the American Civil War into the First World War. During the time of the Enlightenment, we had characters like Isaac Newton who believed in things like, well, we understand our arguments about gravity and Newtonian physics, but he also believed in something we'd call alchemy, that he could turn lead into gold through a sort of mysticism. In elements and throughout the entire Enlightenment, you don't have this pure idea of science versus religion. In fact, so much of science and religion are working together, and yet they also are finding themselves at odds through mankind, not through themselves. The Enlightenment included the Age of Discovery, but much of that Age of Discovery was taking place near the tail end of the Enlightenment. But the cracks in modernism began to show. The cracks in the Enlightenment began to show, especially especially during the 1800s. At the end of the 1800s, we had the philosophy of Nietzsche, who talked about the death of God, and in no great terms was he happy about that experience. It was a common thing that you'll find in literature of this sort, describing something that is not necessarily how it ought be. We saw the expanse of the moral consequences of Darwinism, which played no small part in the expanse of the slave trade, and that slave trade led to the Civil War in the United States. We also saw failures one of the major failures in rationalism in World War I, where all these so-called rational countries all went to war against each other, all while claiming to be rational. And if they were all appealing to one objective truth, one objective truth that could be achieved through rationalism, why were they then going to war with each other? It might even call back to the era right before the Renaissance, where you had all of these so-called Christian kingdoms at war with one another. Were they not all following the same God? The challenge in these paradigms oftentimes looks the same as these things reflect themselves throughout history. And what we saw at the end of modernism, particularly in the scale of World War I, was it followed by a depression that was much deeper than what we saw in simply the economic Great Depression of America. Suddenly, postmodernism began to emerge, and postmodernism began with a doubt it began with a skepticism of man's ability to perceive objectivity, but that grew and grew into a doubt of objectivity itself, and it continued to grow until it became the new paradigm. Postmodernism as a paradigm can be seen in a number of phrases that are all too common today. Perspective is reality. We're all subjective, therefore therefore truth cannot be known. Speak your own truth. If I can't understand it, then it cannot be understood. Chapter 2: The End of the Secular Age. So now that we've talked a little bit on how we got to the postmodern age, or something that Charles Taylor refers to as the secular age, let's talk about not only what it feels like, but what it has started to produce. The beginning, as I addressed earlier, the beginning of the secular age may not have been birthed in hope so much as a response or a reaction to the failures of rationalism. The failure of the paradigm of rationality had produced in its culmination these great tragedies and these great upheavals across the known world. Not only did you have the start of the end of the rational period with the French Revolution and its total abandonment of tradition on the one hand, for tradition of another, but that new tradition being deeply fused in a very somewhat post-rational approach, where mankind alone was itself its own justification. You saw a great series of upheavals, particularly this era of revolutions as well. We've talked about the history of philosophy at least within this framework, as an important build-up to the secular age itself, as something that started out of an explanation that we can understand, even if we don't justify it, but then we want to get to how it has produced the era that we live in today. So the secular age, as according to Taylor, Charles Taylor refers to secular as a third type of secularism, where belief is simply one option amongst many. And what this means is that anyone can really believe whatever it is that they want to believe. Belief is a thing that we choose. It's a thing that we wear. It's something that we put on like clothes and we take off when they're no longer valuable to us. The core anchor of belief, or maybe let's call the axiom of belief, the axiom of the mechanism of belief, would be that of authenticity. You can believe whatever you want to believe so long as you believe it authentically. And as soon as you come to the point where you no longer have that authenticity, it is entirely reasonable, according to this paradigm, to let go of that belief and find something more suitable to yourself. Now, you might be starting to already identify the weaknesses in this, that if you yourself are a fallible human being, but yet you yourself bear some sort of authority through authenticity to determine whatever is true for yourself, then that axiom bears the fatal weakness of you being flawed. This axiom of authenticity can then become its own death, its own collapse. If a man can change what he believes like he changes his clothes, what then does his belief mean to him? How does he wear them? A man wears his belief through virtue signaling. And much of this virtue signaling, if you track back through history, can look at how different forms of what are later that are referred to as revolutions are all seen as liberations from something. The Industrial Revolution, which in America took place at the late 1800s, early 1900s, or at least in that key element, was a liberation from material limitations, that every man could have wealth and you could have this continual growth concept. You saw political revolutions through the 1800s into the 1900s, whether it's Stalin or Mao or the Greek revolutions, or even the second attempt at a French revolution in the 1830s, as a liberation from kings or governments or regimes or that type of serfdom. There were cultural revolutions, which were liberations from something as vague or as concrete as a cultural norm. We know that this culture accepts this as norm, but they shouldn't. We need to have a cultural revolution about it. There's the sexual revolution, which includes both medical advancements as well as cultural shifts that liberated people from biology, whether through the birth control pill or what came after. And then there are technological and digital revolutions today that even tempt us with a liberation from an analog life, whether it's through things like the Matrix or living forever somehow through digital means, AI, and so forth. But these revolutions, this liberation has come at a cost. If our beliefs are merely fashion statements, then the only meaning that they have is what we give them. If what it is that binds us together and gives us meaning is ultimately dependent on ourself, that would become, well, in a crass sense, a self-licking ice cream cone. How can a thing determine its own value? How can an essence or an identity determine its own, a being determine their own identity and its own essence? Hint at that later. And our beliefs are displayed, we display our beliefs like fashion statements, as we know what a Catholic might dress like, or a Protestant, or an Orthodox, or a Muslim, or a person of Orthodox Jewish tradition. And yet we can admire what maybe different cultures hold on to or display, but ultimately it still comes down to something as mere and as shallow as aesthetics. This has created in some cases a bit of violent individualism. It's created this element of violent individualism in a sense that the only thing, if I myself am the axiom of my belief system, then any attacks against that belief system are also ultimately attacks against myself. Any challenge to the legitimacy of the religion, whether I acknowledge it or not, is brought up, then that is actually not just an attack on what I think to be true or what I believe to be true, but it is an attack on my person. We find this distasteful, especially in the realm of virtue signaling, whether it's through social media or accusations of LARPing, or politicians who pander to what they imagine is somebody else's sensibilities or culture or care without actually producing it. Now, these are some of the symptoms that have grown out of it, but the question still remains on how does the structure of this belief system even function? How do you have a society that has a mass of individuals who all have their own little beliefs? How do they get along if we, in the Nietzschean sense, kill God with our bloody knives? Well, the problem that's been created in our world is that something has replaced that united worldview, but it's sometimes as vague or as nefarious as something like multiculturalism. In the violent individualism of that can come out of this secular age, one does not offend the gods, that rather they offend an individual's sensibilities. And it comes as no surprise that this axiom of belief has produced so much death, whether it's how somebody justifies the use of violence against somebody who simply doesn't think the way they do, all while somehow strangely mocking the religious wars of the past. The crusade of communism, when compared to that of the crusades of the 1100s, doesn't really look all that different on some ideological terms, but there are variations. Let's not be too quick down that line. Skipping right past where we should appeal to some higher standard, if I myself am the highest standard, at least for myself, how do then you and I get along? We talk about multiculturalism. You believe what you want to believe, I believe what I want to believe, and so long as we don't hurt each other, we'll get along just fine. Well, you have to ask then, what does it mean to harm somebody? If I then get to determine what is harm, how then do you get to have any say in what that might be? How does one culture and another culture with antithetical beliefs coexist peacefully in some sort of pseudo multicultural environment? Well, in order for them to do that, there must be some overarching belief system. This belief system is the thing itself that is supposed to inform multiculturalism, that if you believe what you want to believe and I believe what I want to believe and we don't hurt each other, keyword, if we don't hurt each other, where do you get that? Where does that belief come from? Where does this idea that we can just create a cohesive society with antithetical worldviews, but still somehow have a similar goal. Pragmatism makes sense in some arenas, but it doesn't in others. Just like libertarianism is a great political philosophy, but it's very difficult, if not impossible, to execute in political reality. The feeling of the secular age, the feeling of postmodernism has also begun to unmoor people from their environments. Now, there are other factors included in this, but many of them are also made possible by the undergirding philosophy itself. If we live in a postmodern age where the pursuit of the individual is the greatest possible good, then how else could that not function but build factories and build empires for the individual themselves, and also create the environment where we have modernism that are not modernism, postmodernism in the form of cities and metropolitan areas where we find ourselves more and more disconnected from not only where we get our food and where we live, but also where we find our sense of community. Sure, I live in a high-rise with 50 other families, but my real community is all online. It's all in the internet. It's all through the people who I find common ground in conversation with. It might not be the people that I work with anymore. It might not be the people that I live with anymore, and I might as well stop going to church because, hey, that's a fashion statement anyway, and it doesn't really mean anything. And then we have to challenge the question of by what standard multiculturalism even functions. It's not to say that this itself is an argument against multiculturalism, but it's a problem that it has to deal with. How then do we choose by what standard which cultures are considered acceptable within the greater umbrella of multiculturalism? This problem is not exclusive to the religion that is multiculturalism. In fact, evangelical Christianity has dealt with it, and as well as broader Christianity for thousands of years, sometimes to disastrous effects. And it is that profound hubris of the postmodern worldview that one can simultaneously criticize the immorality of, say, the Spanish Inquisition or the religious wars of Europe before America was founded, while also believing that it's okay for they themselves to build secret investigative units and institutions to find out heretics against their chosen worldview. The profound hubris of someone who might say that the Crusades were bad, but it's okay if we get rid of all of those people over there because they themselves don't approve with our moral worldview. And that is made even easier on the individual if they refuse to accept that the thing that informs that worldview is itself, by definition, a religion. So secularism, it's not to talk about unbelief or belief itself, but the mechanism of belief does create problems. Someone might believe that in a rationalist sense that there can't be a possibility of God because it doesn't rationally make sense, but I'm still relying on something being true, as opposed to, well, truth is relative to my own perspective, my own desires, my own will. And the words that have come out of it, the words that are starting to populate I won't even say the conversation, the words that are starting to populate the feeling, especially amongst my generation, are words like ennui, anemoia, and a sense of being disconnected from your community, disenfranchisement. Why should I even try? Cynicism has rushed in, filled the gap left by some sense of naivety, and now cynicism is all I have left to live by. Secularism and this belief system, where I myself am the axiom of that which is valuable to me, ends up running aground at some part. And I think it's happening very rapidly, and I'm observing it. I'm observing it happen rather rapidly in people in our world, where they are saying, wait, this version, this American Dream 2 or 3.0 of you can do whatever you want, be whatever you want to be, doesn't really deliver the meaning that it's been declared to give. We're watching in real time, whether it's through the internet or through social media or through the people that we interact with on a daily basis, that the promise of that American dream, that you can be whatever you want to be and believe whatever you want to believe is coming out to be a philosophical poison. Follow that road to its ultimate conclusion and you run into a problem. You can really pick two options. One of them is you have to accept that as truth, thus accept that first as truth, that you can believe whatever you want to believe and be whoever you want to be, but at the cost of whatever you want having no meaning. You aren't serving anything that is true except for whatever you feel like at the moment. If you don't happen to be a narcissist, you might find this hard to hold on to for a long time. Or when you achieve these small goals that are, or even large goals that are couched and framed in whatever you want, they oftentimes don't come with the prize, the reward, and the sense of meaning that you desired. Graduating Ranger School doesn't make you a better person. It just simplifies that you've done something. It doesn't give you a sense of belonging or having arrived. It's just another step in what now is starting to look like an endless path, or an endless series of hurdles forward, going nowhere. Or if you were to paraphrase or take this as a microcosm version of a macro statement, a small, similar reflection of a much greater truth, if you gain the world but lose your soul, of what good is it to you? Of what value is hedonism if while you engage in the hedonism of self-destruction, you know that you don't even enjoy it, but you try to convince yourself that you have to enjoy it, because if you don't enjoy it, all the work to make it happen was all for naught. So the one option ultimately is what's this sort of secular, this secular three, this third form of secularism produces. It produces its own suicide. The West engaging in this idea of nothing is of meaning except for whatever we determine to be meaning ultimately looks like, by all standard metrics, that it is killing itself. We can't keep up with our debt. We don't know how to afford our own homes. Food is becoming hard to purchase. Our political division is so sharp that the two groups of people look like they might as well be from different countries or even planets entirely. We find it harder and harder to sit down with our relatives who believe or vote for a different candidate. We also wonder if this whole religion being nothing of value at all, our dish that we were served really doesn't mean, it really isn't what it's choked up to be. So this is the common path towards this idea that the axiom of belief, the axiom belief as, or the axiom, the hinge of belief, the foundation of belief being authenticity, ultimately results in suicide. It doesn't mean anything. It's all meaningless. Why should I try? I won't succeed anyway. Success is even outside my realm, and if I were to achieve it, it wouldn't be worth it anyway. We're seeing the evidence of this in the suicide rates among young men, or among veterans, or among our population. It doesn't reflect that of even this idea of what we thought would be perhaps an anemoia of a world where people could work a simple blue-collar job and pay for a family of four, or something like that. Again, things that we've never experienced. The suicide that we're experiencing can be calculated in numbers. If you look at the numbers of soldiers who died during the global war on terror, both Iraq and Afghanistan, compared to the number of veterans who committed suicide in that window, you might be looking at a 1-to-10 ratio, 1 death to every 10 suicides. The thing that's killing us is not out there. It's here. It's in our own philosophy. It's in our own belief system. It's in our own community. And the roots of those beliefs have been growing deeper and deeper, and yet rotting for 200 years, 400 years, however long we might want to draw the long arc of this kind of postmodern belief. But instead of just attacking postmodernism as if it was some sort of monolithic culture structure that we could disassemble and then reassemble in our own liking, we're finding on the individual level that no, living for ourselves in this new American dream isn't working. The secular American dream ends in suicide. So we have that, or we have the resentful corner, which we've seen from the likes of Mao and Stalin and the communists and the Marxists, and we've seen it try to essentially produce itself as its own self-sufficient religion. Now, there's no surprise that it has its own disparate groups of people who complain about different things and argue about different things, but ultimately it comes back to the individual is God, let us create mankind in our own image. And so we have option one with the secular age carrying on and ultimately coming to a close is suicide, democide, or faith. When coming to the end of the road of the new American or the secular American dream, men are faced with a decision. Do they go one way towards nihilism, whether it's hedonism and self-destruction, or do they go the other way and they find faith or something that reminds them of what faith might look like? Traditionalism, tradwife, whatever we're talking about when it comes to the homesteading traditionalist lifestyle, as if somehow that alone could provide the meaning sufficient enough to sustain us. You see microcosm versions, small versions of this repeatedly reappearing in things like media, whether it's the urgency of the moment driving you from one chaotic disaster to another, or the sense of standing up and fighting for something you believe in, but only after enough evil has happened. But rather, and what is most important in this option here, or this what we're looking at is what I think will be the end of the secular age, is that secularism is falling, and it is falling apart on its own lack of merit, and it's being replaced ultimately with religion. You have the old God, or you have the new God. You have the God of the Bible, or the God of Islam, or the God of Buddhism, or the God of whatever that people tend to choose, or you have the new God, the God of the government, the woke, the Marxist. The individual is God himself. The identity is without an essence. This death of secular isn't so much an argument that it should happen, but that it is happening, because the secular age, if we are going to refer to the postmodern age as the secular age, is going to be one of the shortest ages in this description that we have encountered. The medieval period may have lasted for hundreds of years. The Enlightenment at least had 300 to 400, give or take, from late 13 to really 1400s into the stretching to, well, roughly the 1800s. Postmodernism starting at the early of the 1800s, and we're only in the beginning of 2020, and after a 200-year stretch, it looks like postmodernism is falling apart. It doesn't hold water. It doesn't sustain the life of those who even believe it. They either spiral into madness, or they end up in some form of suicide. So the question then remains, well, then what then do we do? What does a person do? Are we going to really obscure the conversation from addressing how there seems to be profit in people complaining about the world and only distracting you with some form of history of philosophy and then a condemnation of the world? No, we're going to have to move on to chapter 3, moral injury and holy war. One way of categorizing a war is by its most common injury. We might think of shell shock when we hear about World War I, or perhaps even the nuclear bomb or gunshot wounds from World War II. Not even World War III, we're not there yet, but Vietnam, it's hard to think about Vietnam without thinking about the consequences of Agent Orange and the chemicals that were used in that conflict. Now, for the global war on terror, including Afghanistan and Iraq, there seems to be two competing injuries that define the war. The first is a TBI from the use of higher explosives, whether it's through breaching or artillery and IEDs. And the second, though, is PTSD. Not 10 years ago, you couldn't throw a stick without hitting at least some veteran-run charity for veteran suicide, and yet the numbers continue to climb. Now, PTSD itself is a bit of a tricky subject because on the one hand, there's a very physical aspect of it. There is the possibility of chemical imbalances or a weariness from being in war for 20 years, or there are physical injuries, whether they're from TBI or related. But there's a second side to PTSD, which is not as easy to address from the medical world, and that is moral injury. Moral injury in itself is equally as solid, but in a world that has neglected the value or the weight or the component of man that is the spiritual by trivializing it into merely a fashion statement, we should not be surprised that moral injury could very well be the defining injury of our day. And that is exacerbated at a greater level as we are seeing what we call war shift from a von Clausewitz concept of conventional war, maneuvers, tanks, and so forth, to something that's much more insidious, or what we would call an insurgency. Suddenly, the population is both the target and the tool for creating the motivation for overturning a government or a society. When we deal with this second type, this not necessarily new but re-emerging style of warfare, which before von Clausewitz would definitely have fit into the category, but during that time post-Napoleon to about World War II, was sort of left a little bit at the wayside or didn't make its way as much into public perception. Since World War II and the advent of the atom bomb, we have seen its rise only increase and increase and increase. So if we are familiar with seeing the moral injuries of PTSD take place for soldiers who have been to war, should we not be surprised if that same tool is used against you, or the people, or the family unit, or the foundational structures which support a society? Moral injury itself oftentimes can be categorized in two different forms. One would be witnessing something evil, that one believed that they were responsible for stopping, or they could have been responsible for stopping, but failed to do so. Imagine you're a sentry on a gate, and in a moment of weakness, you realize that you have to, I don't know, make a phone call, grab a snack, whatever. And so you ask your buddy to take your place, and as soon as you do, that's the moment the sniper's shot rings out, and your friend now is dead because you condemn yourself for having a moment of weakness. Another version of moral injury would be something like you are a part of a unit or a team, and the leadership or something comes down from the leadership that commands the unit or the team to do something that you determine to be severely immoral. We're not talking about small tragedies like white lies. We're talking about heavy, evil, dark things. But you go along with it because you're afraid. This second type of moral injury isn't as simple, but it does take place, and you see it replicated in stories and novels and events like My Lai. And so the moral injuries that we're talking about are unsurprisingly difficult for our contemporary world to have or to handle. It's difficult for our contemporary world to handle because we have grown up not knowing anything other than that third type of secularism, which reduces morality into a fashion statement. And so as we see the rise of moral injury continue to take place across cultures and societies, where citizens are expected to look the other way when great evil atrocities are taking place in their backyard, when politicians condemn them for seeing what is evil and calling it out, when we see something like human trafficking explode across the United States, but it's not the trafficking which is condemned, but the people who seem to continuously call it out. Imagine being a citizen of the United States and seeing and knowing and finding and having evidence that the trafficking of women and children is taking place in your very country, possibly aided and abetted by people who are claiming to be part of the government, so long and so forth. And yet you can't do anything about it. You just have to sit down and shut up and pay your overpriced gas bill. It's not easy to connect the cost of resources alone to something like this, but this isn't the first time slavery has existed in the contemporary world. But what we might expect to see, and what I believe we are going to see, is that as the secular age collapses under its own weight, it cannot hold water, it cannot hold itself up. We are going to see it shift from the mechanism of belief as authenticity to something else. We are going to see the rise of a new form of religion. Perhaps we might find the reinvention of old gods. The secular age will fall, and it will most likely, and the most likely course is not for it to divulge into a further secular system. And again, secular not as a lack of belief in God, but secular as simply that faith is a matter of accessory. What we're not going to see that, I don't think we're going to see that secularism increase in this realm. I think what we're going to see is the opposite. We're going to see a recoil from the wastefulness, or the what's the word I'm looking for? Ambiguity, the arbitrariness of belief to some form of more centralized belief system. In fact, we've already seen something like this reoccur and reinvent itself time and time and time again. We saw the Marxism of the Bolsheviks and the Marxism of the Maoists, and we're seeing the same thing take place in the United States. We're seeing it happen across the Western world, where the center component is not some sort of faith system alone, but a faith system where at the top of the hierarchy is the state. The state is God. We might be able to, or we might want to claim that this is just some recursive version of Marxism, but that would not explain why this very system has existed in the past, long before Karl Marx ever gave his speeches or wrote his books. In fact, we're seeing a reinvention of the old gods. Instead of Baal worship, we have the worship of the state. Instead of the worship of Asherah, we have sexual liberation from creation. Instead of Moloch, we have the sacrifice of our own children, whether through you might call it abortion, or just the neglect of our own children for the sake of stability at home. The third form, or the culmination of this, is seen in our day and age today with politics as religion, where the newsman has replaced the pulpit as not only the person who tells you what might be going around, but how you have to think about it and how you ought judge your neighbors. It wasn't too long ago where the person in the television was telling us to hate those who didn't follow along. Now, religion... Marxism, or great man there are other ways of what politics of religion might look like. We might address it on the left, or we might address it on the right, and there are concerns for something like a great man, a savior of some sort. But we all really do know in our hearts that neither Trump, nor Jordan Peterson, nor Tim Walz, or any of your political heroes can save, quote, the country. So in order to bolster ourselves, in order for modern contemporary secular man to bolster himself from moral injury, whether it is delivered through political means or social means, he has to invest in something as if it is more true than himself, or elevate himself to the level of God. In order to bolster ourselves from moral injury, peoples, governments, and institutions will create their own religions. This raises the question of spiritual war or holy war. If every war that we look at is fundamentally motivated by a religious cause, the accusations of the so-called atheists that these holy wars are great atrocities starts falling on deaf ears because, well, not even deaf ears, it starts falling apart. Because when you look at the things that inspire men to act in certain ways, you cannot help but identify them by definition as religion, whether they're worshiping a god, or the state as God, or themselves as God. There is a way that Christianity, or contemporary or modern Christianity, has attempted to present this concept of spiritual war, and I want to make a challenge to what that model looks like and present something else. Oftentimes when you hear about spiritual war, you hear about this idea of the overworld and the underworld, or that there is the physical world that goes on in our life. If you were to take this into medieval terms, the mundane or the profane or the secular. This is not the same as the old the secular we're talking about. This is the job that you do for work, whether you are a blacksmith, a bootmaker, or a plumber, whether you're an engineer, or you are an arithmetist, or you are a lawyer, there is this idea that we have this world above, and then there is the world below, the secret world, which has recreated itself in millions of stories from not from Lord of the Rings, sorry, well, there is a little element to that, but from Harry Potter to The Matrix to even books like Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces, that you have the mundane life of people going about on the surface, but underneath that, there is some secret world that's going on. If you find the code, something like the book of, or the Marvel comic, I think it's Marvel, it might be DC, of Hellboy, where he has to go into the secret underground world to really solve the problems that are at hand. This model of spiritual warfare ultimately, I think, diffuses the individual from action in the life that they live in, because it mysticizes everything that might be considered spiritual warfare or the conflicts that happen outside of the mundane, and it trivializes them in a way to some sort of kind of magic system. Now, pick a hard magic system or a soft magic system, and they might be related to it, but ultimately, I think it is missing a piece. It is missing a piece when we talk about spiritual warfare because it sort of explains away all the things that can't be explained and fits the accusations of certain critics that it is just explaining all the evil away. Rather, if we look at spiritual war from the standpoint of those who have fought in war, we might look at it a different way. Ask yourself this question. Before we get to the question, look at it this way. If you take conflict between individuals and you start at the very base level, the individual himself, he has equipment and techniques, and then at the higher level, he has tactics. Good tactics can beat mediocre techniques, or good tactics can beat, let's say, mediocre tactics can defeat great techniques. So having better tactics, because it's a higher level, can defeat kind of weak techniques or strong techniques. A person might be skilled at doing something like reloading a rifle or sprinting or whatever, but if the person who he is in conflict with can predict his actions and use tactics as sorts to invert his advantage, then that person will win. But what is above tactics? Tactics oftentimes exists on the team and the squad and the platoon level, which is in American military doctrine, something around 120 people kind of at the top, but you can change by unit to unit and era to era. So sound tactics can defeat excellent techniques. Sound strategy can beat excellent tactics because, again, tactics are kind of a macro set of techniques, and strategy is able to circumvent good tactics. But what is above strategy? It might be something like ideology or belief. Now take a look at it at another way. Take a look at spiritual warfare at another way. What good will your training or your equipment do if you are subject to moral injury? Look at what we are facing in the country right now. What good does your training do against the homeless epidemic in your neighborhood? What good does your ability to use radios what good does that have against the sort of propagandistic degradation of your society? How can you defend yourself from moral injury with only a tool? It clearly doesn't work. Are you prepared in body, but weak in mind and heart? Soldiers and fighters oftentimes debate between gear and skill and fitness. They oftentimes will debate about whether a piece of equipment does effectively counter a lack of skill in an area, or whether a person should train more or work out more or whatever. You can find infinite minutiae in that arena of men and women debating whether or not they should do a certain thing, train a certain way, act a certain way, buy a certain piece of equipment, so on and so forth. But in our secular age, the spirit is always treated as an accessory. You look at the American military, and you will have people whose job is dedicated at building up a strong supply line, logistics. You'll have people whose job it is to train up soldiers, team leaders, squad leaders, platoon sergeants. You'll have people specialized in specific roles, NBC, which is nuclear, biological, chemical, or you'll have people who are snipers and demolition experts, and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. But we also have chaplains. Yet at the same time, in our secular age, it's not that we don't have chaplains, it's that they are treated as merely an accessory. Do you feel bad? Well, maybe you should talk to the chaplain, but don't say too much because it might get you in trouble. It might pull you off the line. The injuries that are inflicted on the soldiers, and we look at statistics like for every one soldier or similar, every one American service member killed in combat during the global war on terror, there were at least 10 who committed suicide in that time. It clearly isn't bombs, bullets, nor beans that's causing the greatest number of casualties in the West. It's something much deeper, something that requires a lot more earnesty to look at. Consider what it is that you believe at your core. Why are people committing suicide? We can't seem to treat it with enough drugs or enough counseling or therapy sessions. Rather, we might look for some sense of community, but ultimately it is because the piling up of moral injuries that these people have encountered. It might be worth arguing that half of what we call, I don't even know what statistic, it might be worth looking into that how much moral injury takes place when soldiers and service members return from a deployment to the United States only to see a trivialization of everything that they've been working towards. It's that the people around them don't take it seriously, or they can't really integrate into a society that no longer cares about right and wrong, good and evil, and what is true and false. Perhaps the moral injury they're incurring is not happening over there, it's happening right here. So that brings us to the closing segment, the closing question. We've talked for some time about the history of philosophy, at least a subsection of it, and how we've gotten from the development or these different eras where you had revelation as the axiom of belief, to rationalism as the axiom of belief, and then now to our era where it's authenticity as the foundation, or the paradigm of authenticity as the axiom of belief in our world. And yet we can no longer be surprised when we witness people who are encountering and incurring moral injury after moral injury after moral injury, whether it is through politics as religion or placing a supreme value on the state. We also can look back into history, or we can look back into literature or scripture even. The Bible speaks about this in Ephesians 6:12. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. If we look at it simply as sort of the overworld and the underworld, there is this idea of the physical and the mental alone. Those who are familiar with Plato might see this. What we might end up doing is ultimately cheapening ourselves because we don't know how to act in the spiritual world, short of something that is indecipherable from something like mysticism. Rather, if we play the long game, if we look at spiritual warfare as an integrated system, as something that we must treat, we have to train the body, discipline the skills and mastery, and then we must also pursue what is right and true and good. We can look at spiritual warfare as something that is both beyond the physical world and something that we can interact with in our own lives. It might look like you not waiting for permission to do the good that you know you ought do. It might look like choosing to take responsibility for what you have influence over. Sure, you may not be able to change the city council of Minneapolis or affect the presidency in anything more than a vote, but you do have places where you can work, where you can make good influence, and you are living in a world that is trying to treat you like somebody who can be subjugated and subdued while they go about playing in the playground or playing in the arena. Think of your position at a school. Are you participating in the academic world, or are you continually being beaten down by its slow and steady degradation? Are you being defeated on the spiritual plane? Is moral injury crushing you from upholding the values that your work or your school or your family or your community or your church are supposed to be sticking to? Or are you realizing that it is easier to betray the values that you hold dear and allow that to suck the life out of your soul, suck the life out of your well-being? If we talk about spiritual forces and we recognize, or we believe that there is something beyond just the physical world, that there are things like moral injury that take place. It is an abstract object, by the way. It is an abstract concept that if we believe in spiritual warfare, we must recognize that moral injury can be inflicted upon us by things that might look like they're outside of this world. Are you crippled by a sense of guilt for not doing the thing that you ought do? Are you afraid to read the book, be it the Bible or some form of literature that is just too challenging for you because, oh, well, you're not good enough yet? Are you refusing? Are you waiting to go to the gym because you're not ready? Are you not ready to go compete in a competition because you don't have the right gear? What is holding you back? What might be keeping you back from doing the things that you know you ought do? Of strengthening your community, building your family, building your business, or encouraging your friends, your community, instead of waiting for somebody else to build a community and you join it to start somewhere. Instead of taking the risk and starting somewhere, are you being subjected to, are you yielding to, are you being defeated by a continual experience of moral injury? Do you believe that you're in a holy war? Well, you better get started, because you're in one. The battle for the soul does not take place in some spiritual abstraction. It takes place in the day-to-day, in the things that you do today and tomorrow. It takes place in the work that you put into the things that you understand are valuable. It takes place in obscuring and distracting you from pursuing what you know is right and true and good for the sake of convenience or expedience. It is looking for some great man of earthly creation to save you from all the ills of your community, instead of doing the small amount of good that you can do in your area. Instead of as the secular age comes crashing down, as it starts dissolving into its decentralized state, perhaps we will see something come from it. The question is, will it be right and true and good, or will it be another era of madness? Once again, you best start believing that you're in a holy war. You best start believing that you're in a spiritual war, because you're in one, whether you recognize it or not. Now go forth and conquer.